I thought I knew my wife. I thought we had built a life together, a family, a future. But nothing could have prepared me for the truth I uncovered, a betrayal so deep, so twisted, that it shattered everything I believed in. She wasn't just unfaithful. She wasn't just sneaking around behind my back. She was having an affair with one of her own students, a boy half her age, someone she was supposed to guide, mentor, teach. Instead, she taught him something else entirely. At first, I ignored the warning signs, the late nights, the locked phone, the way she pulled away from me little by little. But when I discovered the messages, when I saw the truth with my own eyes, I knew there was no coming back. I had married a woman I didn't even know. This is the story of how I uncovered the ultimate betrayal, how I found out my wife was cheating in the worst way possible. It's a story of lies, deception, and the painful realization that sometimes the person sleeping next to you is hiding a secret life. Watch until the end to see the shocking truth unravel. Would you have forgiven her? I woke that morning as I always did, to the soft weight of dawn pressing against the curtains and the distant chirping of birds, a sound I had come to associate with the quiet, steady rhythm of my life. The house, still wrapped in the last shreds of sleep, exhaled around me, floorboards settling, the wind brushing against the windows, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I turned over, expecting the familiar warmth beside me, but my hand met only the cool, undisturbed sheets. I blinked, my mind slow to process what my body already knew. Evelyn wasn't home. It wasn't entirely unusual. She was a teacher, like me, but with a different pulse to her life. A woman who needed movement, connection, nights out with friends. I had never resented it, not truly. I had always been the steady one, the anchor. I liked my routines. Waking early, making breakfast for our son, seeing the world through his eager, trusting eyes. It gave me purpose. I sat up, rubbing a hand over my face, pushing away the lingering haze of sleep. The bedside clock read 5:42 a.m. The sky outside the window was still a pale gray, the street lamps casting their final flickers before surrendering to daylight. Zach's voice broke the stillness, a small, bright call from his bedroom down the hall. I stood, stretching as I moved toward his room, shaking off the last threads of unease. "Morning, buddy," I murmured as I pushed open the door. Zach sat up in his bed, hair tousled, his stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. He gave me a sleepy grin, rubbing his eyes with his small fists. "Juice?" I smiled, ruffling his curls. "Yeah, let's get some juice." I carried him downstairs, settling him in his booster seat at the kitchen table. The act of preparing breakfast, the crack of eggs against the pan, the scent of coffee blooming in the air felt grounding, familiar. It was the part of the morning I loved most, the quiet space where life felt simple, where I could focus on nothing but the small, tangible joys of fatherhood. And yet, beneath it all, something gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The absence beside me in bed, the untouched pillow, the silence of my phone, void of any message from Evelyn. Still, I told myself not to overthink it, not yet. Then, the back door creaked open. I turned, and there she was. I had expected relief when Evelyn walked through that door, but what I felt instead was something else, something colder, something that settled beneath my skin and refused to leave. She barely looked at me. Her body carried the weight of exhaustion, her hair a tangled mess, her clothes wrinkled and clinging in ways that told me she had slept in them, or not slept at all. The faint scent of alcohol clung to her, mixed with something else, something I didn't want to name. She mumbled a greeting, a half-hearted attempt at normalcy, and disappeared upstairs without so much as a glance at our son. I stood there for a long time, hands braced against the countertop, staring at the empty space where she had been. The air still held the imprint of her presence, but it felt wrong, altered somehow, as if I were standing in a house I no longer recognized. I told myself to let it go. I told myself not to look. I told myself that if I let her sleep, if I let the morning continue as it always did, the weight in my chest would fade, and the world would return to what it had been before. But I knew better. So when Evelyn finally collapsed into our bed, still in the same rumpled clothes, her breathing slow and heavy with the remnants of the night before, I stood at the foot of the mattress, watching. I should have woken her, should have demanded an explanation, should have given voice to the unease growing inside me. Instead, I reached for her phone. It wasn't something I had ever done before. I had never needed to. She was my wife, the mother of my child, the woman who had once whispered her secrets against my skin, who had once reached for my hand in the dark just to feel that I was there. But that woman had not walked through the door this morning. I pressed the power button, the screen illuminating in the dim light of the bedroom. Her lock screen showed the time. 6:18 a.m. The battery was nearly dead, the red sliver of warning blinking in the corner. I swiped up. I knew her password. Not because I had ever needed to use it, but because I had seen her fingers dance across the numbers 100 times before, had watched her unlock her phone absent-mindedly while talking, while laughing, while sipping wine on our back porch. It was muscle memory. And just like that, I was inside. The messages loaded slowly, my heart pounding in sync with the flickering of the screen. The weight in my chest pressed harder as I scrolled past the usual exchanges, group chats with her colleagues, reminders from the daycare, old messages from me. Then I saw his name. Ben, a student. I knew the name, knew his face. A senior in her class, no older than 18, with the kind of careless confidence that came with youth. I had heard her mention him before, offhand comments, a passing remark about a student struggling with his grades, a joke about how he reminded her of boys she had known in high school. But this was not that. I opened the conversation, my fingers suddenly unsteady. The messages spanned weeks, a slow evolution. At first, the texts were harmless, discussions about assignments, late-night questions about upcoming exams. But then, something shifted. A new tone bled into the words, playful teasing, inside jokes, late-night messages that had nothing to do with school. And then, the pictures. Not explicit, not at first. A photo of her legs stretched out in front of a fire, a selfie with a glass of wine in hand, lips slightly parted, the kind of expression she used to send me. A picture of her bed, unmade, captioned, "Wish I wasn't here alone." And then, his response, "Come over." I swallowed hard, scrolling further. The night before. A series of messages sent in the early hours of the morning. Ben. Where are you? Evelyn. On my way. Ben. Better not be lying. Evelyn. I wouldn't lie to you, baby. Baby. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep reading. 3:21 a.m. Evelyn. Leaving soon. Ben. You better not sneak out on me this time. Evelyn. I wouldn't dare. My stomach twisted. My breath came too fast, too shallow. Then the final message. 4:07 a.m. Evelyn. Good night, troublemaker. Ben. Next time, don't leave so soon. The phone nearly slipped from my grasp. I could feel the blood rushing to my ears, the cold sweat forming at the base of my neck. I was breathing too hard, the walls closing in, the edges of my vision narrowing. I turned my head, looking at her. The woman lying in our bed, her body tangled in the sheets, her lips slightly parted in sleep, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I swallowed back the nausea rising in my throat. I had wanted to be wrong. I had wanted to believe she had simply lost track of time, had stayed too late at a friend's house, had been reckless but innocent. But there was no innocence here. Only him, only her, only the words between them that I could never erase. I set the phone down on the nightstand, my hands trembling as I stepped back. The house around me was still the same walls, the same furniture, the same morning light filtering through the curtains, but I no longer belonged in it. I had woken up that morning a husband, and now I was something else, something broken, something alone. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the motions of my life like an imposter. I poured Zach's juice, buttered his toast, nodded when he told me about his dreams, but I wasn't there, not truly. My body functioned, as it always had, but my mind was still upstairs, still staring at the screen of Evelyn's phone, still rereading the messages that had shattered the foundation of my world. She woke up hours later, bleary-eyed and slow-moving, her head cradled in her hands as if the weight of last night had finally settled upon her. She barely spoke to me, just murmured something about being exhausted, about having had too much wine with the girls. I let her lie. I let her move through our home as if everything were the same. I let her brush her lips across Zach's forehead and smile at him as if she hadn't spent the night with someone else's breath on her skin. I told myself I needed time. Time to think. Time to understand how a woman who had once shared my dreams, my bed, my son, had also found the space within herself to whisper secrets to a boy half her age. But more than anything, I needed proof. Because despite everything, the messages, the late nights, the way she had crept into the house with the scent of someone else clinging to her, I knew her well enough to know that if I confronted her now, she would find a way to twist the truth, to weave another story, to look me in the eyes with practiced innocence and tell me I was being paranoid. So I did what any man does when his life is slipping through his fingers. I waited. I watched. And I followed. For days, I studied her the way a scientist studies an unfamiliar specimen, detached, methodical, observing every movement, every pause, every flicker of something unspoken in her gaze. I paid attention to when she picked up her phone, to when she turned away slightly, to the subtle way her lips curled when she read his messages. She thought I didn't notice the way she shielded her screen from my line of sight, the way her thumbs moved faster when she thought I wasn't looking. She had no idea that I was always looking. I began checking her location history when she left the house, my hands steady, my breath measured, the guilt of invasion overshadowed by the growing storm of betrayal. The lies unfolded easily now, as though they had always been there, waiting to be seen. Work meetings that ended earlier than she claimed, errands that took longer than they should, nights out that blurred into something far more damning. I followed her once, not because I wanted to catch her in the act. I already knew the truth, but because I needed to see it for myself, needed to shatter the last remnants of doubt clinging to my mind. She left the house on a Tuesday evening, her goodbye casual, her kiss absent. "Just dinner with Megan," she had said. I nodded. I smiled. I told her to have fun, and then I waited. 15 minutes after she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed, careful, patient, my car lingering just far enough behind hers to stay unnoticed. The drive was short, not to a restaurant, not to Megan's, but to an apartment complex I had never been to before. I parked across the street and watched as she stepped out of her car, smoothing her dress, checking her reflection in the side mirror. She wasn't dressed for a casual dinner. She was dressed for him. And then she walked inside. I waited an hour. Then two. I told myself to leave, told myself there was no point in sitting there like some broken man picking at the wounds of his own betrayal. But I couldn't. I sat in that car and imagined it all. The way she would smile at him, the way her voice would soften, the way she would touch him with the same hands that once traced patterns across my skin in the dark. At 11:12 p.m., the apartment lights switched off. She was staying the night. That was when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Watching from the outside wasn't enough. I needed to see it. I needed undeniable proof. So I did what any man would do when pushed to the edge of his own sanity. I placed cameras in our home. Tiny, hidden, tucked away in places she would never think to check. In the living room, in the hallway, And the most damning of all, in our bedroom. It felt disgusting. Felt like I had crossed some moral boundary that I could never step back from. But then I thought about the lies. About the way she kissed our son goodnight with lips that had whispered someone else's name. About the way she let me hold her, touch her, while carrying the weight of another man's hands on her skin. And suddenly, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like justice. It took only 2 days before I caught them. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, when she thought I was at work, when she thought Zach was napping. I watched the live feed from my office, my hands cold, my breath slow, my entire body locked in a state of frozen anticipation. She let him in through the back door. A boy. That's all he was. A boy, barely a man, standing in my house, in my space, with a casual confidence that made my stomach turn. He dropped his backpack by the couch. She kissed him before the door even closed. I felt something in my chest tighten so violently I had to press a hand against my sternum to keep myself from shaking. She pulled him upstairs, into our bedroom. The camera caught everything. The way she led him onto our bed. The way she touched him with hands that were once mine. The way she whispered to him, soft, guiding, teaching. And then she undressed him, undressed herself, and I sat there, watching, unable to look away, unable to stop the sick realization that this wasn't new for her, that this wasn't hesitation or uncertainty, this was practice. She had done this before, and she would do it again. I don't remember leaving work. I don't remember the drive home. I only remember walking through the front door, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the air, the distant sound of the shower running upstairs. She thought she had time. She thought she was safe. But she had no idea. I knew everything now, and there was no coming back from this. The hardest part wasn't watching it happen. It wasn't seeing her with him in the space that once belonged to us. It wasn't the way she touched him as though it were second nature. It wasn't even the way she smiled in that slow, knowing way that told me this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something she regretted. The hardest part was pretending I didn't know. I walked through the front door that evening just as I always did, my keys jingling in my hand, my breath steady, measured. Zach ran up to me, arms wide, and I scooped him up, pressing my face into the soft warmth of his hair, grounding myself in the one thing that still felt real. He giggled, his small hands wrapping around my neck, oblivious to the weight pressing down on my chest, oblivious to the way the walls of our home were caving in around me. And then, there she was. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, washing dishes as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't spent the afternoon in our bed with another man, a boy, really. Just a child playing at something he didn't fully understand. She turned when she heard me, a smile already forming on her lips, casual, easy, as though she had no reason to hide anything. "Hey, babe," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel, walking toward me with the same practiced ease she had always possessed, the same fluidity, the same quiet confidence that had once drawn me to her. I stared at her, forcing my own smile to mirror hers, nodding as if I hadn't spent the past few hours watching her betray me in real time, as if I didn't still feel the weight of it pressing down on my ribs, as if I didn't still hear the echo of her laughter muffled against the pillows of our bed. I kissed her cheek, just as I always did, and she tilted her head up toward me, eyes soft, expectant, like a wife greeting her husband, like a woman who had spent her day running errands, picking up groceries, tending to our son, not like a woman who had lain beneath someone else, who had whispered things meant only for me into another man's ear. I had thought anger would come. I had expected it to consume me, to burn through me, to turn me into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. But there was no fire, only cold. Only the slow, creeping realization that whatever had existed between us, whatever trust, whatever love, had already died long before I had known to bury it. We sat down to dinner, the three of us, and I listened as she spoke about her day, about how Zach had been fussy during nap time, about how she had run into an old friend at the store, about how she had been thinking about repainting the living room. I watched her hands as she gestured, the same hands that had held mine, the same hands that had once traced patterns against my back in the middle of the night, the same hands that had helped bring our son into this world. I wondered if she had washed them before making dinner. I wondered if she had thought of me at all while she was with him. I wondered if she even cared. I wanted to ask. I wanted to stop her mid-sentence, to say her name in that quiet, deliberate way that always made her pause, always made her look at me, really look at me, and I wanted to say, I know. I saw everything. I wanted to see what would flicker across her face in that moment. Fear, guilt, maybe even relief. But I didn't, because I already knew what she would do. She would lie. She would tilt her head, furrow her brow, let just enough confusion slip into her expression to make me question myself. She would reach for my hand across the table, squeeze it gently and say, "What are you talking about?" She would deny it with the kind of conviction only a woman who had been doing this for a long time could manage, and she would weave another story, another excuse, another carefully constructed truth designed to keep me exactly where she wanted me. And maybe, if I had been another man, a different kind of man, I would have believed her. But I wasn't that man anymore. That night, I lay beside her in the dark. Our bodies close, but not touching. The silence between us filled with things unspoken. I listened to the rhythm of her breathing, slow and steady, as if she were at peace, as if the weight of what she had done did not exist for her the way it did for me. I stared at the ceiling, at the faint patterns of moonlight shifting across the plaster, at the shadows stretching and shrinking as cars passed by on the street outside. I thought about our wedding day. I thought about the way she had looked at me when she had said I do, the way her fingers had trembled when she slipped the ring onto my hand, the way she had laughed when I whispered we did it against her lips, as if we had pulled off some great heist, as if love itself had been a victory. I thought about the night we brought Zach home for the first time, the way she had cried as she held him, her body curled protectively around his tiny frame, the way she had whispered, "I love you so much," over and over again, as if she couldn't believe he was real. I thought about every moment, every memory, every version of her I had ever known. And I realized something. The woman lying beside me wasn't that woman anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. Maybe it had happened slowly. Maybe it had been inevitable. Maybe love is just another thing that withers in the dark when no one is paying attention. But whatever the reason, whatever the cause, the result was the same. I was lying next to a stranger who wore my wife's face, a stranger who had my son's eyes, a stranger who still whispered my name in the dark but no longer meant it. And the worst part, she didn't even know I had already left her. A man doesn't lose his wife in a single moment. It doesn't happen in the sharp, sudden shattering of glass, in the kind of instant collapse that leaves behind wreckage obvious enough for the world to see. No, a marriage dissolves slowly, so quietly that you don't even notice the foundation cracking beneath your feet until the ground is already split apart. I spent days, weeks, pretending that nothing had changed, that I could still sit across from her at the dinner table and listen to her talk about mundane things, as if I didn't know she had been in our bed with someone else just hours before, pretending that when she kissed my cheek before heading out the door, I didn't already know where she was going, pretending that when she curled up beside me at night, I didn't feel the presence of another man's hands lingering on her skin like an echo I could not silence. And yet, in the spaces between, in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I felt the weight of knowing pressing down on me like an unbearable thing. I had thought, at first, that I could live with it, that if I didn't say it aloud, if I didn't name it, it would lose its power, that I could compartmentalize it the way one does a distant tragedy. Something that had happened, yes, but something that did not have to define me, I had convinced myself that I could endure for the sake of our son, for the sake of the life we had built, for the sake of some old, foolish hope that if I held on long enough, I might find my way back to the woman I had once known. But I was wrong, because the truth does not become smaller when ignored. It does not fade, does not grow silent. It only burrows deeper, spreading its poison through everything it touches. It started with the little things. The way I could no longer bring myself to touch her. The way I flinched when she reached for me, as though my own body was rejecting the lie before my mind had even formed the thought. The way the sound of her laughter, once warm and familiar, now felt foreign, artificial, a relic from a time that no longer existed. The way my hands clenched into fists when I saw her glance at her phone, the way my stomach turned at the sight of her smiling down at the screen, I began to notice more. Not just the affair, but the patterns. The way she was always drawn to admiration, to validation, to the thrill of being wanted. The way she basked in the attention of younger men, of students who looked at her like she was something to be admired, something unattainable. The way she had always thrived on being desired, as if love, for her, was not about connection, but about conquest. I started looking back, retracing the steps of our marriage, re-examining the things I had once brushed aside. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the flirtations I had once convinced myself were harmless. I had thought I knew her, thought I understood her, thought we had built something real. But the woman I had loved was not the woman who lay beside me now. She had been something else all along, and I had been blind. One night, I caught her watching me. I had been sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me like something heavy, suffocating. I must have been quiet for too long, because when I looked up, she was standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on me with something I couldn't quite place. "What's wrong?" she asked, and for a brief, absurd moment, I almost laughed. What was wrong? Everything. Every moment, every breath, every word that passed between us was now built upon a lie so vast that I could feel it in every corner of the house, like a second presence living alongside us. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I realized something. She knew. Maybe not about the cameras, maybe not about the nights I had spent sitting in my car, watching the house from a distance, wondering if I had the strength to walk away. But she knew that something had shifted, that I was no longer the man I had been before. I could see it in the way she hesitated, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the way she suddenly seemed too aware of the silence stretching between us. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if she felt any remorse. If she lay awake at night thinking about the way she had unraveled everything we had built, if she ever looked at me and felt even the slightest echo of guilt. But then she tilted her head, gave me that soft, practiced smile, the same one she had always used to smooth over tension, to deflect, to manipulate, and I knew the answer. Number. She felt nothing. And I was done pretending. The realization did not come like a revelation. It was not a single moment of clarity, not a sudden understanding that struck me all at once. It was slow, inevitable, like the changing of seasons, like the gradual fading of light at the end of the day. I could not stay. Not for her. Not for the memory of what we had once been. Not even for our son. Because the man I was becoming, the man who held on to resentment like a drowning thing clutching at debris, the man who watched her with quiet, simmering loathing, the man who had to force himself to smile in his own home, was not the man I wanted my son to know. And so I made a decision. Not in anger, not in desperation, but in quiet, resolute certainty. I would leave. I would let her have her lies. Let her have her conquests. Let her continue whatever version of herself she needed to be. But I would not stay to watch it. I had already lost my wife. I would not lose myself, too. Decisions like this are never made in a single moment. They come in waves, slow and relentless, eroding everything that once felt certain, until one day you wake up and realize there is nothing left to hold on to. The love, the trust, the quiet faith that had once tethered you to a person, it has all been chipped away, leaving behind only the hollow remnants of what was. And so, when I finally made the decision to leave, it did not feel sudden. It felt inevitable. I had spent weeks, months, trapped in the quiet agony of knowing, of watching, of pretending. I had told myself that I was staying for Zach, that keeping our family together was more important than my pride, more important than the festering wound that had become my marriage. But the truth was, I had not been staying for him. I had been staying because I had not yet found the courage to leave. Because leaving meant acknowledging the full weight of my failure, not just the failure of my wife to be faithful, but my own failure to see her for what she had become. It meant admitting that I had spent years loving a woman who no longer existed, who had perhaps never truly existed at all. But the moment came, as I knew it would, on an otherwise ordinary evening, when I looked across the dinner table and saw her for what she was, a stranger wearing my wife's face. She was speaking, something about her day, about a phone call with a friend, about some meaningless detail I should have cared about. But I was no longer listening. I was watching the way she moved, the way she laughed at all the right moments, the way she carried herself with that same effortless charm that had once drawn me to her. And I realized then, this was who she had always been. A woman who lived for admiration, a woman who needed to be desired, a woman who had never been satisfied with the quiet, steady love of a husband who adored her because it was too familiar, too constant, too certain. She thrived in uncertainty, in the rush of new hands, new lips, new eyes, watching her as if she were something rare, something untouchable. And I was done being the man who watched her slip away. So I put down my fork, folded my napkin carefully, and said the words that had been forming on my tongue for months. I want a divorce. It took her a moment to register what I had said. She blinked, her body stilling, the mask she always wore slipping just slightly as she studied my face, as if searching for some trace of hesitation, some sign that this was a bluff, a moment of weakness she could talk me out of. And when she found nothing but certainty in my gaze, something flickered in her expression, fear. Not the fear of losing me, not the fear of losing our family. No, Evelyn feared losing control. For so long she had held the power. She had dictated the terms of our marriage, had pushed boundaries and blurred lines, had tested just how much I was willing to endure, and each time I had given her what she wanted, forgiveness, patience, understanding. But now she was seeing something else, something final. She set down her wine glass carefully, exhaling as if trying to gather her thoughts, trying to find the right words to pull me back into the web she had so carefully spun. "Honey," she said, reaching for my hand across the table, her voice soft, soothing, the way it always was when she wanted something. "I know things have been tense lately. I know you've been stressed. Maybe we should talk about this." She was still trying to salvage it, because she still didn't understand. There was nothing left to salvage. "I don't need to talk," I said, my voice quiet but firm, unwavering. "I need this to be over." I could see the cracks forming now, the subtle shift in her posture, the way her fingers curled slightly against the table, her jaw tightening as she realized this wasn't a negotiation. This was real. "Is there someone else?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharper now, desperate to find an angle, a way to turn this back on me. "Is that what this is about?" I almost laughed. The irony of it. The woman who had spent months, years, maybe, slipping out of our bed and into someone else's had the audacity to believe that I, the man who had spent all this time holding together the fragments of our broken marriage, was the one being unfaithful. "No," I said simply. "There's just you, and that's the problem." For the first time, she had nothing to say, because she knew exactly what she had done. And now, she knew the price she would pay for it. The weeks that followed were a storm of anger, of desperation, of carefully crafted manipulation. At first, she tried to change my mind. She cried, She begged. She swore she would do better, that we could fix this, that she still loved me, that I was throwing away everything we had built together. Then, when she saw that her tears held no weight, the rage came. She accused me of being heartless, of being cruel, of not caring about our son, of abandoning my family. She spun stories, tried to paint herself as the victim, the neglected wife who had only strayed because she was lonely, because she needed something from me that I had not given her. But none of it mattered. I did not love her anymore. Not the way I once had. Not the way a man is supposed to love his wife. I loved her only in the way that a man loves a ghost, something that once was, something that had haunted me for far too long. And so I left. I took Zach with me. I gave her the house, the furniture, the carefully curated life she had built around herself. None of it mattered to me anymore, because for the first time in a long time, I was free. And she was left with nothing but the wreckage she had created. At first, she still tried to salvage her reputation, to hide the truth of what had happened. But the world has a way of unraveling secrets, of exposing the things people try hardest to keep buried. It wasn't long before people started whispering, before the rumors spread. About the student, about the betrayal, about the husband who had walked away, taking their child with him. She lost her job. The school could not ignore it, not when the truth was laid bare. And the boy? He moved on, because that's what boys do. They move on, they grow up. They forget the older woman who once made them feel powerful, who once made them feel special. He left her behind, just as I had. And Evelyn? She was left alone. Alone in the house that once held a family. Alone in the life she had built on a foundation of lies. And maybe, in the end, that was the greatest punishment of all, because she had never feared losing me. She had feared losing control, and now she had neither.